Well, welcome to this very unusual special concert with two of the most fantastic string quartets by the greatest master of the string quartet. And when the program was put together, the idea was to have Beethoven's first string quartet that he wrote when he was about 27, 28 years old. It's not clear exactly when he started it. And then end with not quite his last quartet, but the quartet the most famous and the most admired, perhaps, of all the late quartets. So that we have here a span of nearly 30 years, from a young man in his late 20s to Beethoven right in the last year of his life. And to begin with, I thought it would be fun to try and trace the journey that he went on from one to the other. But the more that I looked at the music, the more I thought, what's so extraordinary about this man, who was in his own lifetime thought of as the greatest composer of string quartets that had ever been, and is still regarded as that, for all the greatness of Haydn and Mozart, that the most extraordinary thing is that he found his voice in the string quartet so early, and that this early piece, which the quartet will begin with in the long second half of the concert, we'll try and keep this half really short, that piece is amazingly and magically paired with the late quartet. And I'll come back to that in a tiny second. So we have nearly 30 years of Beethoven's supremacy as a string quartet composer. And in his own lifetime, and especially in the city of Vienna, where he lived and worked for most of his adult life, the string quartet was regarded as the highest of the musical forms of the time. That's very, very interesting, because it tells you something about why Beethoven worked so hard at the string quartets, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But it also places the string quartets not just in the context of his music, but in the context of what his contemporaries, the culture to which he belonged, what they thought great art was about. Now, every period of human history has its buzzwords, its labels, its ideas about what art is for. And one of the key words of the time, when Beethoven was alive, is in the German-speaking countries, was the word sublime. Great art was intended to be sublime. And for the admirers of Beethoven and those who loved his music around Europe, no music of his was more sublime than his string quartets. I want to read you a small paragraph about the sublime by one of his greatest contemporaries, the poet Schiller, who wrote the words, of course, that are set to music in the Ninth Symphony. And in 1801, Schiller, who didn't know Beethoven personally, as far as I know, but they had many friends in common, Schiller wrote a famous essay called On the Sublime. And here's what he says: the sublime is a mixed feeling. It is a combination of woefulness and joyfulness, which rises up into rapture, and which is preferred by fine souls, that means you and me, to every other pleasure. This union of contradictory feelings in one single feeling proves our moral independence. And then he goes on: the sublime is what enables us to leave the sensuous world where we see only beauty, not gradually, for there is no transition from dependency to freedom, but suddenly and through a shock, tearing the independent spirit away from the net in which it had been ensnared. The soul remembers in that moment his better destiny, throws himself into the waves, and is free. That's really interesting. It tells you so much about what they thought the sublime was, and how one of the interesting aspects of the sublime at that period was that they went and looked. The German word for sublime is erhabener, which means lifted up. And in fact, sublimis in Latin means lifted up. But they wanted to find what the etymology of this word was, where it came from. And they decided, actually modern scholars say wrongly, they decided that it meant to the threshold. To the threshold. As though when you experience the sublime, you come up to a door, you step across the door, and you're in another world. And in the poetry and the music and the painting and the architecture of Beethoven's day, this idea of crossing the threshold is found everywhere, and especially in his music. And I wanted to ask the quartet to play, first of all, the very opening of this very first string quartet, Opus 18, number 3, in D major, because it's a perfect example of what they understood at that time about this moment when you step from this world into another world. It's not a melody, it's a part of a melody, but what's really important about it is this drama of moving from there up to here, above us. And now the piece can begin. It's a gesture like a door opening or a window opening, and suddenly we see a new world. Now, I mentioned that this string quartet was written in one of the great string keys, D major. And some of you may think, and many of us may think, well, I can't really tell one key from another. And of course, if we play the piano, the keys are not, in fact, that different, because all the keys are weighted in such a way that we can move from one key to another. But on the beautiful instruments that the string quartet is playing, that's not so, because they're tuned to specific strings. Eric, could you show the strings of the violin? So, a key like D major resonates with those strings, and it means that when the musicians play a chord of D major, as they do at the very end of the first movement of this quartet, if you listen carefully, you can hear the strings vibrating after. Do you hear how long the sound lasts? Now, the sound can last with those overtones in another key, but in a different way. So D major, the key of this early quartet, it's a key perfectly suited to the instruments. But the late quartet, which we'll end the concert with, the C-sharp minor quartet, that's a much more difficult key. It's a much more remote key on the stringed instruments. There's still resonance, but it's a very different kind of resonance. And I'm going to ask the string quartet to play the final chords, which you'll hear again at the very end of the concert tonight. I wonder if you can tell the color is very different, because you're not getting the same aura around the notes.
Gerard?
Yep.
It has to do with open strings. I think you're implying that.
Yep.
D major, we got those open strings and the others as well. C-sharp minor, there are no open strings.
There are no open strings, so there's no vibration coming in response to the chord that they play. And if you look at the time when Beethoven was writing, people were very clear about the importance of the difference of the color of the different keys. We know, for example, that when Joseph Haydn went to London and his music modulated from one key to another, the audience, which was not particularly educated, would burst into applause because they found it so beautiful. Another great writer like Schiller of that period is the famous E.T.A. Hoffmann, the man who wrote the stories which became the Nutcracker and Coppelia and Tales from Hoffmann. And he wrote one of the most famous essays ever about Beethoven, which was published in the newspapers at the time, actually halfway between the writing of the first quartet you're hearing tonight and the writing of the second one, a little closer to the first quartet. And here's what he says. Beethoven's instrumental music unveils before us the realm of the mighty and the immeasurable. Here, in his music, shining rays of light shoot through the darkness of night, and we become aware of giant shadows swaying back and forth. And among those giant shadows are the shadows that you hear in the vibration of the instruments. And Hoffmann goes on to explain why this is so. So you have an early quartet in this bright key of D major, which Fred was showing us how it's vibrating with the open strings, and the late quartet in C sharp minor, which is not vibrating with the open strings in the same kind of way. In Hoffmann's terms, it's a dark key as opposed to a light key. But the fascinating thing about these two quartets written nearly 30 years apart is that they're connected. So, in the late quartet, in the C sharp minor quartet, opus 131, he begins in this very remote key of C sharp minor, and then he moves into the bright key of D major. And I'm wondering if the quartet can just play that magical moment when the whole thing shifts up from darkness into light. And suddenly, they're in a different world. And the extraordinary thing is that in the early quartet, he pulls exactly the same stunt. That quartet's in D major, but in the course of the first movement, he goes into darker and darker keys until he ends up in the key of C sharp, the same key of the late quartet. It's an accident. It's nothing to do with it. It just tells us something about the way Beethoven heard. And so, yum, pom, you heard that move in the late quartet. Now listen to the same move in the early quartet. And there it is again. It's moved back from darkness into light. Of course, you can find these things all over Beethoven's music, but there's something very beautiful about the pairing of this early quartet and this late quartet. And in the course of the early quartet, Beethoven is fascinated by the journeys into darkness, these journeys to these very remote keys that are not vibrating with the open strings of the instrument. And I just want to play you two more examples. I want our friends, the quartet, to play you two more examples from the early quartet. Here is the opening of the slow movement, not that slow, of the early quartet. And it's in quite an unexpected key. In Hoffmann's terms, that is a darker key than where the quartet began. But he does the same journey. He starts to go into darker and darker areas, as we'll hear in the next music example, number 7. And the key, ladies and gentlemen, I don't know how many people here play the piano, but the key that he's moving towards is the key of D flat, which is actually on a piano the same as C sharp. So it's almost as though the darkness that Hoffmann describes, that Beethoven's music can reveal, is constantly being represented by the same harmony, the same mysterious key, which is, as it were, nothing to do with the ostensible key of the quartet. So here's this passage where it journeys into that dark area. About this kind of move, Hoffmann wrote, "We become aware of giant shadows swaying back and forth, moving ever closer around us and destroying us, but not the pain of infinite yearning in which every desire, leaping up in sounds of exaltation, sinks back and disappears." It may sound very, very grand language for your experience of the music, but I think it's really fascinating to know that in Beethoven's day, that's how people heard the workings of this music. But harmony was not the only way that string quartets could be sublime. Another way in which they were sublime was in the art of counterpoint, the art of writing for different voices. Hoffmann's very clear that there are no voices, there are no singing voices in the string quartet, so there are no words. There are instead 4 completely independent players. This is another very important part of the sublime in the conception of the time. The sublime was very closely connected in the minds of people like Schiller and Beethoven with the idea of freedom, with the idea of independence. Remember that this was not so long after the American Revolution and very close to the French Revolution. So ideas of freedom and growing into a better kind of human being through freedom, these were very, very important, and people reflected them in music, in poetry, in different kinds of art. And in order to get this freedom, people started going back to an earlier kind of music, the art of the fugue, which is really an art from nearly 100 years earlier, practiced by people like Handel and Bach. And Beethoven especially was fascinated by the idea of using fugues in his string quartets. So some of you may remember that he wrote the so-called Grosse Fuge, the Great Fugue, as one of his last string quartets, which is the last movement of his B-flat quartet. It's absolutely huge. It's a kind of monster fugue, and it created a scandal. And everybody said, you mustn't do this in a string quartet. So he promptly followed that by beginning the next quartet, the one we're hearing tonight, with a fugue. You tell me I can't do it, I'm going to do it even more. So he begins this wonderful Opus 131 with a fugue in C-sharp minor. And I just want to listen to the opening 2 entries there, the first 2 voices. There's something very strange about this fugue. If you look at a Bach or a Handel fugue, the next voice, the second voice, and if you have a 4-voice fugue, the 4th voice, enters a 5th above the first subject. But in this fugue, the second voice comes in a 5th below. It's almost like it's another way of moving into Hoffmann's darkness. Beethoven could have written it the conventional way, and we had a go earlier at what it would have sounded like had he done it the usual way. And so that we're very grateful to Eric and his colleague that they're going to give us their version of what it might have been. Very beautiful, but it doesn't have the same sense of mystery that the version he has that he ended up with. Fugues were there from the beginning. Yesterday in rehearsal, Jonathan was saying that all the bad composers of that period knew that they had to put fugues in their string quartets. And he said it's a really exhausting thing. You play 3 movements and you turn the page to the last movement, and there's one of those damn fugues, and you've got to play all the way through. In Beethoven's earlier string quartets, he doesn't do that. What he does is to give you scraps of fugue in the middle, because these are moments when the four instruments all take off as though they were part of a fugue that's been going on, which we haven't heard. It surfaces in the music and then disappears again. And I'm going to ask the quartet to give you a couple of moments. Here's a moment from the first movement when Beethoven does exactly that. Wonderful.
Just Chame, then me, then next person, next entrance, just the entrance, please.
Yeah. Wonderful, like an X-ray. You hear then the ghost of a fugue running through the music. In fact, there are quite a few. I went through the score of this quartet last week, and I reckoned I found about 9 or 10 places in it where that's what Beethoven is doing. Let's just hear one more, a particularly beautiful scrap of fugue from the slow movement of this Opus 18, number 3. So one voice coming in after another. When Beethoven wrote his string quartets, really in 3 lots, 3 islands, if you like, in his life, towards the end of his 20s, and then there was a space of about 10 or 12 years, and then he wrote another set. And then towards the end of his life, when he was in the middle of his gigantic 9th Symphony and the Missa Solemnis, his thoughts started to go back to writing more string quartets. And in order to do this, he took a very interesting decision. He decided that he needed to understand the fugues of Bach better. He'd been playing them in public since he was a little boy. He was famous as a child prodigy for playing Bach preludes and fugues by memory. But here he was, the most famous composer in Europe, and he took, in 1818, so a little while before the late quartets, he decided to train himself up to write quartets in what he called a new way. And he took a Bach fugue and he arranged it for string quartet. And that manuscript still exists. And I'm going to ask the quartet just to play the opening. It's a very famous Bach fugue, but you can see that by arranging it for quartet, Beethoven makes it sound very, very different. Well, that was a very special experience, ladies and gentlemen, because at the time when Beethoven made that arrangement, it was never performed, and nor was it intended to be performed. He was making it to train his own inner ear, to find new ways. It was a way for him to discover how to write for string quartet in what he called a new way with, thank God, more fancy than before, more fantasy than before. Having done that, he embarked on the last quartets, including the one we're going to hear tonight, the C-sharp minor, which, as we've already said, begins with a famous fugue. Could you, Eric, just remind us of the subject? Now, some of you may know that Beethoven sketched endlessly. He loved to write music in the open air. He wore a great big gabardine coat, and he made his own sketchbooks, sewing them together from torn off bits of paper so that they would fit into his pocket. And the sketches for this fugue, for the idea you've just heard from Eric, go back quite a long way. It took him a long time to get where he wanted. In fact, the first one turns up in his conversation books, because you remember he was deaf. So the conversation books survive. He didn't need to write down what he had to say, but the people who were with him wrote down their questions. And in one of the conversation books, and we know exactly when it was at the beginning of 1826, he says to his admirers that he's evidently says that he's thought of a new fugue, a new way of beginning a string quartet. And they ask him to write down the subject. And here's what he writes down, and it's not quite what we ended up with. What it's missing is that beautiful Bach-like hook at the beginning. Eric, could you play the first 4 notes? He hasn't got that. He's got the following bit, but not the first bit. It's a wonderful demonstration of how Beethoven had to work to find these ideas. The other thing he had to work at, we think of a great composer as being able to do his counterpoint exercises very easily. Beethoven was never like that. He worked very, very hard. And a great many exercises in his notebooks survive, which are sketches for what this wonderful fugue is going to be like. Here's one, which never made it into the final fugue, but it gives you a very good idea of his working process. Magical. It sort of comes out of nowhere and goes into nowhere. And it doesn't end up in the piece, but you can find moments in the piece which derive from it, rather like a flower derives from the root. And here is the first time, one more sketch, where we get to what is much more like the beginning of the fugue. So the beginning, first 4 notes are really what we now know in the piece, but it sort of tails off rather feebly at the end, as though he can't quite think what to do with it. But at any rate, he'd now find these beautiful 4 notes, this hook. And that brings us to the next aspect of the sublime, which was very, very important to this generation of German-speaking thinkers, of philosophers and poets and composers. For them, the sublime was a doorway into another world, but it was also, and it was about freedom, but it was also about unity. They were very, very concerned with the idea of unity. Now, you as Americans will know that from the Declaration of Independence, which has quite a lot to say on the subject of unity. Unity was an idea in the 18th century that people were thinking about a lot. And when this piece first appeared, the most astonishing thing for Beethoven's admirers and friends was that that little hook at the beginning, can we have the hook once more, just the 4 notes, starts to turn up all over the other music in the quartet. So instead of having separate movements, the movements are, as it were, leaking into one another. Here, for example, example 17, is the opening of the second section. Now, you may think that's got nothing to do with the hook at the opening, but if you listen to the notes that Eric now plays, you can hear that it's hidden inside there. The same thing if you go on to this quartet, by the way, is in 7 sections, 7 movements. If you go on to the 4th movement, here's how the 4th movement opens. It's a beautiful set of variations. And there the notes are. He squashed the hook, he sort of bent it. And then we can go on to the 6th movement, the truly sublime 6th movement, one of the shortest movements in the quartet, but one of the most memorable and astonishing for people who first heard this quartet. And we have the same phenomenon. And the notes. So these 4 notes are sort of changing shape, almost like an organism at the bottom of the sea. They have the same qualities, but they're constantly coming up with new idea after new idea. One of the people who was astonished by that in the 19th century was Richard Wagner. In 1870, he wrote an essay in honor of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Beethoven. And he wrote about the greatness of this quartet with its wonderful, melancholy, opening fugue. But to his wife, he said, actually, I find the rest of the fugue rather boring. It's the 4 notes that fascinate me. And if any of you are fans of Tristan and Isolde, for example, you will recognize that that's music composed on the same principle of a very few notes, which then leak out through the whole piece. And here, finally, is the opening of the last section, the 7th movement. Wonderful idea, also derived from the same 4 notes at the beginning. And a little while later in this same last movement, the violin plays a beautiful melody. Eric, can you show how that's related to the opening 4 notes of the first movement? And the very opening notes of the fugue. It's almost like a fish that's swimming round and round and round, showing us ever different shapes. Now, this last movement is another movement where we have lots and lots of sketches, hundreds of them, before he found the right idea. We've just heard the very opening of this movement, but here's the very different first idea that he had for it. I think we're rather pleased Beethoven didn't go on with that one. That was put to one side. Then he had another go, example 23. That also was an idea destined to go nowhere. He's got some idea of the beginning, but he's not quite sure how to go on. Can we go on to the next one?
This is played.
Another idea which goes nowhere. So what you can tell from these is he knows he's got his dramatic opening, but he's not quite sure how to go on with the next idea. So he starts to get a bit impatient. These ideas are all in a kind of very fast march-like rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So he decides to have another crack at it in a completely different rhythm, 6/8, a triple beat. Much closer to what we ended up with, but in the wrong rhythm. So he's got to go backwards and find his way back to the original rhythm. And here's where the last example is I want you to hear. Now, what's fascinating about that is that he's really getting going now, and the thing that's helping him to get going is counterpoint. Counterpoint like Bach counterpoint. And that brings us all the way back to the beginning, and the idea of fugues, and the idea of Bach. And indeed, if you think, there's a myth, that Bach was completely forgotten and was only revived in the 1830s, and it's absolutely untrue. It's true that certain pieces of his were forgotten, but the keyboard pieces, the fugues, the preludes and fugues, those pieces were performed all the way through by great musicians. Mozart knew them, Beethoven grew up on them and knew the 48 preludes and fugues by heart, and he knew many other pieces. Here, can you give me Eric, the very opening of the last movement, just those ya-ba-bum-ba-ba-bum. That idea is very closely connected to one of Bach's most famous fugues, which was well known at the time when Beethoven wrote his string quartet. Here it is. It's the beginning of one of the Ritschkas, the fugues from the Musical Offering. Wonderful. Makes me want to hear the whole of that, but there's no time. So Bach was not forgotten, but to return one last time to the sublime, the idea of the sublime. We have the sublime crossing the threshold, the sublime raising us up to another dimension of reality. We have the sublime as freedom. We have the sublime as unity. But we also have the fact that for this generation, at the very beginning of the 19th century, the sublime was something else. It was their rediscovery of the music of the past. So the same Mr. Hoffmann, who was such a champion of Beethoven and who wrote the story of the Nutcracker and so on. Here's a remark of his from another piece of writing entirely. There are moments in my life, especially when I have deeply studied the works of the great Sebastian Bach, at which the numerical proportions of music and the mystical rules of counterpoint arouse in me a profound dread. Music, it is with secret fear, with dread I utter your name, for you are the sound of nature you are the language of nature translated into sound. So for Hoffmann, who was absolutely of the Beethoven generation, Bach represented the sound of nature. The year after Opus 131, Beethoven died, and the great poet Grillparzer wrote a famous funeral speech. And in that, Grillparzer wrote the following words: "We who mourn here are the whole German people, mourning one half of what remained to us from the vanished brilliance of our fatherland. The hero of poetry in our language still lives," he means Goethe. but the master of song, the mouth through which music spoke, the man who inherited and increased the immortal fame of Handel and Bach, of Haydn and Mozart, has now ceased to be. So what you see there is that in Beethoven's lifetime, people thought of him as the heir to Bach. Why? Because these are all German composers. So you have this last idea of the sublime as being to do with the nation, to do with the whole tribe. And to finish, I want to look once more at the very opening of the fugue, just to remind you of what the beginning of Opus 131 sounds like. Eric, I think you played the beginning of it. C-sharp minor. Now, if you turn to the first book of the 48 Preludes and Fugues of Bach, and you turn to the C-sharp minor fugue in that very key, which Beethoven learnt as an 11-year-old and used to play in concerts, here is what it sounds like, arranged for string quartet. The shadow of Bach hangs all over this music, and consciously so. It was part of the world that Beethoven lived in. To end with, I want to take one last look at this mysterious sixth movement, almost at the end of the second quartet that we'll hear tonight. It's in a very strange key, another key which doesn't vibrate with the open strings, G-sharp minor. And here is the beautiful melody that Beethoven writes at the beginning of that movement. Now, the most strange thing about this movement is that when the quartet started to be played around the time that Beethoven died, people started to say, but I know that melody. The trouble was, they all knew it as different melodies. So, for example, when it was first played in Paris, the leading music critic in Paris said, how wonderful, Beethoven is quoting our famous French Christmas carol. Here is the famous French Christmas carol. I very, very much doubt if that was what was in Beethoven's mind when he wrote his sublime sixth movement. However, as if by this story about the French Christmas carol got around all over the place, and as it were in response, a German Jewish pianist, Breslauer, in the 1840s said, no, the melody Beethoven is using is not a French Christmas carol at all. It's the Kol Nidre. And here is a version of the Kol Nidre from Beethoven's lifetime. Very, very beautiful. But I would be extremely surprised if Beethoven had the Kol Nidre going round in his head when he wrote his sixth movement. Who knows what he had going round in his head? As Jonathan said yesterday, the most extraordinary thing about this melody is that it sounds like a melody we all ought to remember, but none of us can agree on what that melody is. There is, however, one fabulous melody by Bach, which he used many times in his cantatas, in his organ music, and in the Matthew Passion, a work which Beethoven did not know, as far as we know, but you know because you've heard it many times. And it is Bach being sublime. And as we go forward in this concert and listen to Beethoven being sublime under the influence of Bach, let's finish this first half with this sublime chorale by Bach. Thank you very much.